Stephanie Burt, Rachel Gold. We have been friends since 2012. We
Yeah.
met because Being Emily came out then, and
Yeah.
you were my moderator on a panel.
Yeah.
And then we really gelled as friends over a number of topics that included comic books.
Mm-hmm.
And because that's central to my book, I wanted to bring that up in our introduction. For the people watching, our plan, getting together to do this video, is that this year is special because we have the same book birthday.
Yes.
So
May
May
20,
21st.
May
Yep.
21st.
And that's why we decided to get to do this video, even though we have some books that are different in a lot of ways, but similar in some really cool ways.
And they're connected far underground, as it were, at the roots. Because they're both about how you get to know people you have a lot in common with who aren't totally overtly like you, and about how you mobilize communities and enter communities in ways that help you understand and accept difference.
Yes. I love that you said that because it's also that's even in my notes.
Okay.
This is how well we think together.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fairly high level of generality because your book involves these amazing teens having adventures, and my book is just like, here's a lot of poems, here's how to read them. You can go read your own now.
I feel like there are a lot of amazing teens having adventures who could read your book though and enjoy learning a lot about poetry and understanding what poetry to share with each other after that.
Well, when I get asked who is supposed to be reading your non-academic criticism, like who do you imagine is your ideal reader, I always give more than one example of a person, but one of the people is always a teen.
And I'm going to say that at least one of my characters, I'm pretty sure, reads your book. So, yeah. I suspect it's Aisha because of the. I reference in my book actually one of the poets in your book with the poem "Wife of Bafa." Because I read it in your book and I was like, well, I read the part about her in your book, and I'm going to screw up her name. Will you say her name?
Oh, Patience Like Bobby.
Excellent. We should probably describe our books, I think, before we continue to geek out too much, because there's some viewer who's thinking, yes, but what are these books about?
Yeah. Should I describe your book and then you describe my book? Is that how it works?
I was going to say we describe our own, but then we say something about each other's books, unless you want to describe my book.
No, that works better. Describe your book.
Okay, so my book is about two very cute teenagers. We meet them at 14 and 15. One is a white non-binary kid. One is a black bi girl, and they're smitten with each other. And they're dealing with issues of gender identity and implicit racism in outstate Minnesota. And the key way they deal with this, in addition to just loving each other, is through the lens of comic book superheroes. So they're both comic book geeks, and they're thinking about, like, how do we take what we know about being a hero, what we know about what works in comic books, and apply it to fighting the racism in our school system.
Mm-hmm. Which is harder than you might think if you're not used to fan communities and people bringing comic book metaphors through superhero metaphors through everyday life, because fighting implicit racism effectively means fighting a system and recognizing a thing that's bad that's kind of everywhere rather than identifying one bad actor and taking that person down.
Yes, exactly. I mean, that's why I wanted to write a book that was about implicit racism, because there are wonderful books that have been written about the explicit qualities and other wonderful books about implicit racism, but really to think about, how do we as diverse communities of people deal with something that the white people in those communities aren't seeing and don't know how to deal with.
Yeah, literally aren't seeing.
Yeah. And, my other experience is that, a lot of times as a white person, I felt like I had two moves on the chessboard of life when conversations about racism come up, particularly implicit racism, which is either like, oh, I'm being called a bad person, I'm going to get defensive, or I'm being called a bad person, I'm going to slink away in shame. And I'm actually not being called a bad person, and neither of those moves is a particularly good move. So I wanted to, through the perspective of teens, and particularly the main character, think about what are the other moves that you can make when you're trying to really be a great ally.
Yeah, and Kaz has a set, that's the white non-binary kid. Kaz has a set of things that they need to figure out and explain to others around them. And in a less interesting book, that would be the book. But the thing that they then need to learn is how to decenter themselves and how to be there for Aisha in a part of her story where Kaz can't take center stage.
Right, right. And literally to the point where, I mean, I'm spoiling a little bit, but towards the end we get to see some scenes where Aisha is center stage and Kaz is very much not.
Yeah.
And I liked figuring out how to do that. Because we're not getting Aisha's point of view. So it was interesting how do I make this interesting to the reader where we're not in the point of view of someone who's center stage, but they're very much the person who needs to be center stage.
Yeah.
We may need to pause for a second, and I will edit this out because Seeley is walking around the side of my computer, unless you think we should have a cat in the video because that makes it more realistic.
I think people watch cat videos,
Oh, okay.
don't watch author videos, and
All right, well,
really,
Seeley has come to say hi.
this is better. Now,
Yeah.
Seeley has what number of teeth right now?
Oh, he has quite a few. He's not Captain Holepunch. Seeley's the shredder.
Okay.
Captain Holepunch is the other cat, Bears, who's I think asleep over on the chair.
Seeley is also not the X-Men writer. Ah, Seeley, we have to keep Seeley there.
There's a little monkey bro.
Oh.
All right. Yes. Okay. So I'm gonna go kick him out. And I'm gonna come talk about your book.
Okay.
Come on, buddy.
Aww. Bye, Seeley. Greetings, readers. Cats are great.
Tell us about your book.
Okay, so my book is called Don't Read Poetry, and the subtitle is A Book About How to Read Poems. And it is an answer to a need and an answer to a problem. And the need is that there are books about how to read poetry that are pretty good books. Some of which are by my friends who've been writing books for longer than me, and some of which are by people who wrote these books in decades ago that don't really go up to the present. The examples are not necessarily contemporary, or they're not broad enough, or they're not diverse enough. Mm-hmm. And there are other books about why, and articles and sort of websites about why contemporary poetry is great that don't address the poetry of the past. And it seems to me that there are some continuities. And that there should be a book about all the things that you can get if you want to start reading poems that are out there for you that includes and addresses poems by people who've been dead for a really long time and poems by people of many different kinds of backgrounds and styles and approaches who are writing right now. So that was the sort of need. But I also address a problem, which is that there are other books and interviews and articles and poets sort of declaiming on the radio about how to read poetry and why we read poetry that get up my nose. And they get up my nose even when they're helpful and well-meant, because they say, here's why we need poetry right now. Poetry will save your life. Poetry brings people together. Poetry empowers your inner self. Poetry connects you to spirituality. Poetry is what we need in the age of Trump. True poetry can demystify and disenchant and dispel your illusions. Poetry can help you get to know yourself. Poetry can help you get to know people who are completely nothing like you. Poetry is this, poetry is that. And sometimes they're accomplished poets saying that, and sometimes they're very talented high school teachers, and sometimes they're sort of TV hosts. And these people who say that, poetry is this, poetry is that, are all like 55% correct, because the word poetry refers, at least for me, to many, many different ways of putting words together and many techniques for putting words together in ways that are interesting. And different techniques produce different sets of words that do different things. Some sets of words are when you are feeling hopeless and shattered and need a way to go on. Other sets of words are when you want to have a puzzle to solve that will slow you down and help you approach life in a way that's more intellectualized. Some sets of words are prayers. Other sets of words are calls to action. Some sets of words are like a song that tells you what's in your heart, and like you're singing them, like sheet music almost, or like when you sing along to something really good on the radio. Other sets of words introduce you to people, characters, ways of being that aren't like you. And there's no way one poem, well, it's very rare for one poem to do all of those things. Different poems can do different things. You might want them in your life for different reasons. And so learning how to read those poems and where to find them and why you might like them involves stepping away from the idea that there's a thing called poetry, and when it's good, it's always good for the same reason. So that's the problem I want to solve, the unhelpful insistence that we should read poetry for one big reason.
Mm-hmm.
That's why it's called Don't Read Poetry, a book about how to read poems. And
I will say that as a person who's somewhat oppositional, I really love the title. And I thought, I mean, it was super helpful to me as a person who has read and enjoyed poetry, but not thought about it tremendously, other than, you know, like using poems for many of the reasons that we do when we're younger, like to woo someone or to feel a feeling with someone else. And
yeah, which are some of the best reasons to use poems, but only some poems work that way.
yes,
Poetry is like music or like comic books, right? Like
right.
This is a set of techniques. Comic books
Right.
are great.
Well, it's funny also because like I'm going to intrude on you on comic books because you said the magic phrase, but you know, I remember being a teenager and like the fights about Marvel versus DC, which I'm sure still go on. You're like, but the notion like there are different kinds of comic books that are doing different things, and you read the kinds that you want at a particular time.
Yeah.
And I thought that was part of what was wonderful to me about Don't Read Poetry is like you've got these 6 chapters that are like 6 tremendous reasons that people read poetry and that poetry persists over thousands and thousands of years. And it made it much more straightforward for me to think about what poems are doing. You know, it's doing one or more of these 6 things. How well is it doing these things? Like I felt so much smarter about poetry reading it.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
That's the idea. It really did feel, I mean, there aren't a whole lot of comics Easter eggs in there. I guess there are a couple.
I found some.
There are a couple, yeah. But it did feel, and this is one of the ways I sort of thought, well, I'm doing this right. It felt like writing about comics.
Mm-hmm.
It felt like here is a shared set of techniques that if you want to talk about why this comic works and why this comic doesn't, or if you want to make comics yourself, you should know like what a panel bleed is, what different kinds of panel-to-panel transitions are, like what foreground and background are, like some things about balloon placement. But different that medium and that set of techniques has so many different kinds of stories you can tell in so many different kinds of styles and worlds that it can encompass. And in a great thing about the comics world is that most people who read lots of comics did not encounter comics first in school. The first experience of comics, whether it is X-Men 121, which was mine, Uncanny X-Men 121, the first appearance of Alpha Flight, or whether it's like Fun Home or Mouse or something, or what's a superhero comic that is perfectly fine but I don't care about, like an 80s Incredible Hulk. If it speaks to you, then you want to know how it's put together, and you might think about how to make it without worrying about whether you're going to get an A in a test.
Yeah.
Not how it's made or what its history is. And if you research it, it's because you are already interested. And there's none of these dreadful institutional counter incentives to saying what you believe. Institutional incentives to say or internalize stuff you don't care about and don't believe. And where poetry is in our culture is almost the reverse. You have middle and high school teachers who do a unit on poetry who don't enjoy reading poetry, who want to get it over with so they can go back to Fitzgerald or whatever they're really into. And students who see it as a chore. And I think classical music people have this kind of problem as well, because if you're really in the composed music world, like, they both use violins, but like, of course, like Vivaldi and Schoenberg, like you listen to them for different reasons, but you have to overcome like music appreciation nonsense to get there.
It's interesting that, you know, poetry is one of the least expensive arts to pursue in a way.
Right.
And I think we all naturally do it. I mean, I wrote poems when I was a teenager. I'm never showing them to you, by the way, but I wrote them. And
I'm never showing to you.
All right, that's fair enough. You know, and then like I said, in college,
I don't know where it is and I can't find it. So I don't know where it is and I can't find it. So.
Oh, I might know where some of mine is, but We're deleting that from the video. Okay, so the point I was going to make was,
Okay.
we actually start out doing poetry at about the same age that we're doing comic book scripts, and then like the problem that you're pointing to is that at some point we become persuaded in high school or college that you can't mess with poetry. Poetry is this canon and it's this fancy thing, and you shouldn't mess with it unless you're a serious poet. And I like how much your book broadening out the sense of what poetry is and what it's meant to do is like, no, it does all these things. You can do any of these things and combine them and have a good time.
Yeah. And I feel like there are people out there whose relationship to poetry is like my relationship to comics, which is like 7th grade, I'm just reading the hell out of these things. 11th grade, I don't have peers who are reading these anymore, and it's not a particularly good moment for comics.
Yeah.
And then I'm an adult, and I come back to it, and it's gotten better and more diverse while I wasn't looking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very true. And okay, so speaking of that, that's on my list of things to ask us. I was going to say, in addition to other things I liked about your book, it's not just about white dude poets.
Well, yeah.
Which I'm about to bring up again. And the fact that you said a poet who uses form well is playing a game. Yes.
Yeah.
We'll maybe circle back around to games in a bit. But speaking of the not just white dudes, we both, I think, went through a lot of work to create books that are not just about whiteness.
Yeah.
And I figured we should probably talk about that.
We should. So for me, that's partly making more diverse friends and more political friends, and having more of my friends who are white be people who think about how to be an ally and how to recognize and decenter whiteness. Mm-hmm. Also, to some extent, making more friends in the poetry world who are not white, and having my friends in the poetry world who are people of color be more willing to talk to a white lady like me about how to do anti-racist stuff. Decentering whiteness and doing anti-racist work, and you were asking me how I ended up sort of at least trying to do that. And I'll finish that and then ask you the same question.
Yes.
Which is that I was sort of trained to do poetry criticism and poetry reading on a canon that was in a body of work that was much more white than what I read now. And sort of grew up mostly among white poetry people who were reading other white people who didn't understand, because whiteness is unmarked, that was a choice, and it's a bad choice. And it's crucial to be reading people who are not like you in terms of race. And it wasn't like I figured that out and the rest of the world of white poetry critics is still like swimming around in their bath of non-wokeness. The entire part of the American poetry world that is white people that was making this mistake before began to think about how to not make this mistake about 5 or 6 years ago, around the time of Black Lives Matter, around the time that Claudia Rankine's Citizen became clearly the most often discussed and most influential contemporary poetry book, which was also around the time that it became clear that if you're just looking at formal talent and making conventionally constructed short poems in verse, which is not a thing Claudia Rankine does, that the major people who everyone else looks up to on sort of technical grounds, that small set of people includes, in particular, Black poets, and that contemporary white poets who aren't putting Black poetry at the center of how we see American poetry are really screwing up and not understanding where we are. Me, that's around reading Terrence Hayes, who's just like the best. But there are other poets who are really significant in that direction also. R.S. Ellis Fermé and Fred Moten and to some extent Kevin Young, lots of people. And the other thing that I really am trying to take account of as a reader, and that book tries really hard to center, is that many American poets and many non-American poets are not black and not white. Race is not just black people and white people.
Yeah.
And there's so much interesting formal innovation, not just representing kinds of people who weren't often seen before by white readers.
Yeah.
Just like stylistic things you can do that come from First Peoples identities and from different kinds of multiracial identities and from East Asian and South Asian and, Chicanx and Puerto Rican and so on. Like, there's just a lot of backgrounds out there, and you're not doing poetry criticism right if you're not paying attention to the forms those backgrounds make possible.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Okay,
so the work that In the Silences does and how you came to do it.
It's way before I actually started writing the book, and by way I mean a year or two, but that's a long time in writing time. So before I started writing the book, and some of the inspiration came from some implicit racism that I saw and was unable to stop, and was surprised that I could not stop it. That at the time where I actually said to a few people in this environment, this is racism, we have to stop doing it, it still didn't stop. So that really showed me how big the situation was, and how even with my white privilege and this is an environment in which I had some power, I still could not fight it the way I wanted to.
Yeah.
So I wanted to figure that out. And a lot of times when I have to figure something out, I write a book about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was like, okay.
Be written. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was like, let me figure this out by redoing this with teenagers in a school system.
Yeah.
And see if they can figure it out for me. And I read a lot of books. I've started listing them on my website for people who are interested. On the In the Silences page, you can start to see the research I was doing to figure out, like, whoa, this is a way, like I was kind of in that, like, okay, this is still a problem in some places, but we are kind of like, we kind of handled racism in the United States, right? No, we really, like, I mean, like, now that's super obvious, but this was before 2016. So yeah. Like, this was happening before that.
No long ago.
Yeah. And then 2016 happened, and I was like, holy crap.
Yeah.
So I wanted to do this book, and then I wrote most of a first draft that was not good, that did not decenter whiteness, and I threw it away. So yeah, you never saw that draft. No one, actually, hopefully no one's ever seeing that draft, where it just, like, it didn't, like, I kind of wrote, I don't know, I wrote half or 2/3 of it, and it just fell into a hole, and I realized that the hole was that I was going in a completely wrong direction. And so that got tossed, and it is hard to throw away a large chunk of words.
But I have half a lit critic book that's like that, where I was just get to 40,000 words, and you're like, I don't believe this anymore.
Right. And like, something is really wrong with this, and like, and it's not fixable. Like, it's not. So that got tossed, and I basically started with the same premise, and I started again. And I think there is no scene from that original draft that's in the published version of In the Silences. Like, I tried to keep some of the scenes, and you may have seen a couple, and like, no, they're just gone, because it just didn't work. And yeah, so then it was an interesting question of if I have a white main character, which I need to have, because in a lot of ways it's a book that, among other things, is about white people talking to white people about racism, which needs to happen.
Yeah.
And is happening a lot.
Hi.
Yeah, exactly. So how do I do that and still have Aisha be a very vibrant, rich character with a lot of agency, who gets to do a lot of things in the story, and have her family be really central and vibrant,
without turning Kaz into just like someone who watches stuff happen.
Exactly. And I mean, I didn't do Aisha's viewpoint in part because there are so many good books by Black authors with Black main characters that readers should just go read them.
Yeah.
Rather than me trying to also do that. So I think that so hopefully it's become a book that, I think, like, it decenters whiteness, but that doesn't mean there isn't whiteness in the book. And in some places, I think I have the opportunity, more so than in Don't Read Poetry, where you really can decenter it because you have so many examples. But in a way, and In the Silences, I have to actually center it and magnify it, in the sense of, like, this is what implicit racism sounds like inside your head.
Yeah, and It really works. And don't read poetry. If I got it right, it's clearly a book by me, but I've got some parts of me turned almost all the way down. And I feel like what it's like to be an effective poetry critic is you recognize that there are all these parts of your experience, and you don't try to pretend that you're not coming from anywhere.
Yeah.
But you try to take certain kinds of dials that are about like what generation you belong to and where you are geographically, and the sort of dial that's about what you're allowed to ignore if you're white, right? Because part of white privilege is having a dial that's like allows you to ignore things.
Yeah.
And turning those dials to a setting that makes you maximally open to voices and backgrounds and approaches to language that are like unlike yours. And there are significant American poets who aren't in the book just because they happen not to provide ideal examples of things. Like and sometimes people who I've been like arguing they're more important than you think, like Frederick Goddard Tuckerman's not in there. But there are also significant American poets who are not in that book because I can't do them justice. I just can't. I can't get there. It would be unfair for me to pretend.
But I think also you did a good job of taking the set of tools you've already got around poetry criticism and applying them to a lot of poets who are poets of color.
Yeah, well, it's not like I'm the only one doing that, but yeah.
Yeah, but I think that's like in a way almost sometimes as white people we miss the elegance of that, where it's like, oh, just like we already know some things about the things we know, we just need to expand the scope.
Right.
So that's technique one, and then my technique one for In the Silences was partly to focus the lens back on whiteness and make it a marked condition. Like you said earlier, like it in America has been unmarked, which means that if you're white, get the privilege of ignoring your whiteness.
Right.
And make it so that Kaz, my main character, can't ignore their whiteness.
Yeah.
They have to really shine the spotlight on their whiteness, on the racist thinking that they grew up with. And it's not dramatically racist, because that's, one of the big problems for me is that we know how to spot dramatically racist thinking. Like at least all of us liberals, we know that, but we don't see the really subtle pieces. Like, just for example, if you are comfortable as a white person making eye contact and grinning at another white person, but you're not comfortable doing that with a person of color, that's a thing you got to work on. Like, and that's something Kaz has to deal with. Like, oh, so I think it works, certainly, I hope, for white readers, and I've heard from some that it does, to spotlight those, like, okay, this is in your head, and you don't have to think of it as being you. So that's my other innovation. And back to comic books, that the sense of implicit racism Kaz then describes as being the evil supervillain Apocalypse and his terrible mind control.
Yeah, and Apocalypse, it's Apocalypse rather than anybody else, because you needed an X-Men villain who exists in the X-Men movies.
Yes.
Otherwise it's too niche. One of the things that literary criticism at its best can do when it's socially engaged, not necessarily of poetry, that In the Silences does really well, is finding a third answer that is better than the two wrong answers to what do you do about racism? The two wrong answers being, it is a matter of bad individuals choosing to be bad and you fight them.
Right.
And it is about a system that we're all inside, like capitalism or like air. And so you as an individual can't do anything in your day-to-day life about it unless you make it your professional goal to destroy all racism everywhere, because it's this large system. And it's not like that.
Right.
It's not like gravity. It's not even like climate change.
Right.
It's kind of like homophobia and transphobia.
I think so. Yeah, very much.
We, like, as queer people, are like sensitized to that just by like being in our heads already.
Right.
As a white person, I am still learning to be sensitive to the way that everyday language and habits and assumptions are, not only cis heterosexist, but also kind of racist.
Well, it's interesting because I've been thinking a lot, especially because in The Silences, so Kaz, the main character, is non-binary and eventually uses they them pronouns. Doesn't start out there, but I was thinking about the because especially early on doing the research and trying to write this, I would get a lot of like mental fatigue just thinking about it because I'm not used to thinking about race that much.
Yeah.
And so I'd be like, oh, whoa, I'm really worn out. And then that moment where I'm like, oh, this is how people feel when I talk to them about gender. Like I can talk about gender all day, but
Yeah.
like cisgender people are like, oh, like we've been talking about this for 10 minutes, aren't we done? And I'm like, are you serious? Like I just got started. And I'm like, oh, so that's how my friends of color feel like talking,
Right.
if they will even talk to me about race. It's like, oh yeah, we can talk for way more than 10 minutes about this if you will listen to me, like if you'll be present and listen. So
Yeah.
it's neat to kind of have that comparison. And I think most people have that in some area of their life where it's like, okay, you're really good at getting this thing,
Yeah.
whether it's about like mental health or disability or class or, like any of those, like, oh, like I could, like I have so much strength in this area because I grew up with it and I had to deal with it. And
Yeah.
like then I have zero strength in this area,
Yeah.
which just means you got to build the muscle.
Right.
I mean, it's just building the muscle.
Yeah, and one of the strengths not only of like novels in general,
Mhm.
but of the kind of novel that this is,
Mhm.
where there's a lot of conversations, there are events that are not conversations, there are multiple plot threads and supporting characters who are not terrible, most of them.
Most of them.
One of them kind of is, but the rest of them aren't. They're sometimes supportive, and because it's YA and because it's 2019 and this is a story about queer teens in love, there's the expectation that at least some problems will at least temporarily or partially be solved.
Hmm. Yeah.
Because of all of those things, I feel like it's easier and more fun to stay in the headspace where you're listening to race and implicit racism get explained
Yeah. Yeah.
than it would be in a nonfiction book or in a work that was more like a work of Afro-pessimism.
Hmm.
Like, Afro-pessimism is a really valid, interesting thing,
Yes.
but it shouldn't be the only discourse about race or the only literary register about race available to white readers.
Hmm.
Like, we need something that says, here is how sometimes some people can ameliorate some problems so you can, be with the person you love.
Yeah. On an interesting side note, one of my beta readers who's black towards the end of the book,
Mm-hmm.
actually like messaged me and said, this is good, but it's a little too optimistic. Like I don't think this would have happened. Like this is a little better than what would have happened in real life. And
Did you make changes in response to that, or
no, I tweaked it a little bit, but then I was like, yeah, I'm doing that on purpose because my fiction is 85% real and 15% optimism. Like the events in Being Emily are a little bit better than what happens for a lot of people in real life too,
yeah,
or at least a little better than what used to happen for people in real life.
right,
And I get to make a slightly better world. Like that's what I want to do with fiction. And she agreed once I explained that. She was like, yeah, like as long as you get that this is slightly better than what would probably happen. I was like, yeah, I know, but I
and
want to leave people in a good
and the
place.
characters know
Yeah.
that they are living in a really good scenario and worse scenarios are possible, and they're like aware of the worst ones.
Yeah. And
And
I did turn it down a little bit for her, I will also say, but it still is pretty optimistic.
yeah, and
Yeah.
there's also like, I feel like this is a different problem in different kinds of like problem novels.
Yeah.
Before literally you started writing, like all of the trans people in all YA got beat up. Like, there was this after school special thing
Yeah.
where like the way that cis readers learned about trans stuff and the way that white readers learned about racism
Right.
was, I mean, fridge is maybe too strong a word, but you have a supporting character who's there for the purpose of getting physically injured,
Hmm.
so that the cis character, or the straight character, or the white character, or the like documented, or citizen character learns how terrible it is to be this other kind of person, and like you need to learn how terrible it is to be the other is not the way to decenter privilege.
Yeah, and I mean we've talked about this a little bit before, but also just the one of the challenges is that yeah, of course these things happen in real life. Like yeah, plenty of trans people get beat up, lots of black kids get shot, well, proportionally to the number of white kids who get shot.
Yeah, newspapers for that.
Right, exactly. There are newspapers. Like we know this is happening. You don't have to always put it in fiction, and sometimes you do. I mean, obviously, like The Hate U Give is a great example. Like absolutely that needed to happen for that book. Great. And we need some of all the different kinds of books. We need some of the kinds of books where the cops do not show up and shoot the black kid, and it's still terrible.
Right. The scene that
right.
Like you see, and someone who, like, the first time I read that scene,
Mm-hmm.
I was like, what is now going to happen that is more narratively interesting than either police initiate serious violence or surprise the police are nice?
Yes, because we've seen both of those, and a lot of times I think once something's been done well or been done well a few times, I don't want to do it.
Yeah.
Other people may still be able to do it well. I'm going to move on because I'm kind of oppositional.
Yeah.
So, so I have a last statement.
Okay.
You want to keep going on this, but I figure I'm watching the clock and we need like a few minutes to brainstorm.
The last statement you have to,
Yeah. Well, so in thinking about both our books together, one of the key messages that runs through them is there are better ways to encounter poems and there are better ways to encounter people than to think that there is one right and natural way to do poetry or to be a person.
And different people want to be encountered in different ways. If you're treating even all the people you're close to, if you're treating them all the same way, like maybe you're not as close to them as you think.
Right.
It's different.
Right. It's not a compliment to treat everyone like a white person.
Right. I
mean, it is a compliment to treat everyone like a full, realized human being with, their own background and culture and experiences. But that's not the same.
White people already treat white people because that would be not decentering whiteness.
Yeah, exactly. And same with, I thought there was in the end, it was very cool that the way you handle poems and the way I handle people came out very similarly. So there are many, and the way we handle heroism. There's many. Say that again. Poems are people.
Poems are people too.
Oh yeah, don't read people. Oh,
yeah.
That'll be our next book.